Welcome back to the Blazor Server in-depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at the logging systems that are built right into Blazor Server, how they work, and how you might want to configure them or tweak them possibly. Okay, so let's go to Visual Studio. Let's create a new project, Blazor app. We'll call it just Blazor app, and the solution name we will call logging demo. Blazor Server App.NET Core 3.1 HTTPS, and hit create. And now we have our Blazor app. So right out of the box, logging is actually enabled and running. It's just that you don't really see it. Let me show you what I mean. If we change this to Kestrel and we launch this just as it is, we're familiar with this window right here. I'm going to leave the web page off the screen for a minute. But notice this says info, and it says the lifetime is now listing on this address and more information. Okay? This is all information that comes from the logging system. Now if I move this off a screen and go to output, there's a whole bunch of information down here, including an almost mirror image of what we saw on the Kestrel window. Notice the comparison here. So both of these come from logging. All right, so I'm going to shut this down now, and let's look at where that logging gets configured, because you'll probably miss it. Let's go to program.cs. And in program.cs, the configuration happens right here. Create default builder. If you don't do anything, then by default, you have some basic logging turned on. The basic logging includes logging to the console and also the debug window, the output window. So both of those are turned on by default, and there's a little bit of configuration, and that configuration is done in appsettings.json right here. So it says, for the logging system, the logging level by default is information. So there's different levels of log statements. So for example, if you had an exception, you would log an error. So log.error, and then you'd pass an exception. Well, that's an error log message. There might be things that aren't quite exceptions or error level, but they're called warnings. And then there is information, and there's debug. There's a few other levels as well, but those are the kind of big ones. And so what this is a hierarchy, where it says the default log level is information, meaning nothing below information gets shown. So in this case, that would mean no debug log messages will be shown. Now, just to make that very clear, let me write out for you the different log levels and their hierarchy so you can see them. The very bottom level, the one that is least likely used, but also probably the most prolific as far as if you turned it on, you would see a ton of them, is trace. And so maybe least likely used is typically we don't turn this on. We don't show this because it just shows a ton of information probably. And so this is used just for debugging purposes. So you have a problem, you can turn trace on, and if you've written information to trace statements, then they'll show up. Okay, I'll explain more in just a minute. But then we have debug, which is kind of one step higher, but it's still kind of for debugging purposes. Then we have information, warning, error, and finally critical. So this is the highest level. I know it's kind of reverse order here. This is the highest level, meaning, let's flip this around. Let me pause the video and flip it around for you. There we go. So now it's an order of least value to most. And so what happens here is in your source code, and we'll see how to do this, you can write to these different log syncs. So you can say, okay, this is a critical message. This is absolutely has to be seen. This is a big deal. This is like beyond we call an error. There's a fatal problem in our application. We can log that. Errors are, hey, we caught this exception, and we can't do anything about it, or maybe there's a problem that is a pretty important one. A warning might be an exception you caught and you dealt with it, but you want people to know, hey, there's a problem here. Okay? Maybe you gave bad information, things like that. An information level log is just saying, hey, this is what happened. This is maybe where you do things like, hey, we navigated to a new page, or hey, we hit this, we perform this action. Just kind of, yes, this is what's happening. And then we get into the two debugging versions, which are debug and trace, and these are used for, you can put these statements throughout your code that would give you information about what's happening in your code. And so what then you can do is normally you might run with warning level or higher turned on, meaning only log this stuff. And then if you kind of want to see how the program is flowing and see how it's working, maybe you turn on information as well. But then if you have a problem in production where you can't hook up and debug, you could turn on these lower when we ran the application, we saw messages pop out. And that's because by default, we're saying information level or higher. This is the default that comes from the template. Now, the reason this is an app settings.json is because this JSON file goes with your executable file or your web application, and it's still in plain text, which means that on the server of your web application, you can say, you know what? We've got an issue we got to track down. Let's change that default to be debug instead and see more information about what's going on. Now, there are two exceptions here, or two tweaks to the system. The first one is, hey, if the namespace starts with Microsoft, then issue a warning message or higher. And this is one of the ways that logging has been improved in .NET Core, is that we can selectively say which things we want to be a different level. So Microsoft has a lot of information statements in their code. And so they say, yeah, the default is information, but for our stuff, you probably just want warning level or higher because otherwise we overwhelmed by stuff that doesn't really matter. It's not going to help you in any way. This is where you could dial in and say, well, the default may be warning, but for anything that starts with Blazor app, we're going to make it information level or higher. So you could play around with these. But then even further, Microsoft said, yes, our namespace and anything below it should be warning, except, and that's what this is down here, where the more specific one of Microsoft.hosting.lifetime, that should be set to information. So let's see more hosting.lifetime messages, the information level or higher. But in general for Microsoft stuff, let's see just warning or higher. And again, the default, meaning everything else, is going to be information or higher. So that's the tweaks to the logging system that are baked right in, and that's the defaults. Let's just start using logging so we can see what different log messages look like, how they work, and they can get into how to configure this. So let's go to pages. Let's just choose the index.razor page. And right in here, we can do an inject. And this would be an iLogger. Control dot, I don't believe works here. So we have to do a at using Microsoft dot, I believe it's extensions dot logging. So iLogger of type index. And we're going to call this logger. There's log. There we go. So now we have, oops, wrong button. Save. So now we have this log up here. Remember, we're using the dependency injection system to get an iLogger of type index. Well, what's index? Well, that's this Razor page. So you can specify any type you want in here, but in this case, I'm specifying a type of the page I'm on. So it knows what page I'm on. So when the log message gets logged, I can capture information about this page. Now I can say at code, to put the code section in here, and then create constructors, CTOR. And now let's just say log dot, we have our options here. Now notice that IntelliCode is saying, hey, here's the one you probably want to look at. Log information, log debug, log error, log warning. And I'll say, you know what? I want to log, let's just do a log information because that's what we're doing here. Just opened up the main page. All right. So with that, we've now created our first log message. Let's save this and let's run our application. And that's not right. We just have an exception here saying that value cannot be null parameter logger. So what's the question? What's the problem here? Is it that we have some sort of configuration issue? Well, no, actually not really. The issue here is how a Blazor page gets rendered. And this is where we're going to go in a more detail down the road. But in general, what happens is this constructor here happens before this stuff up here happens, the inject. And so we actually have a null for our log message. How do you get around that? Well, there is another value, protected override, and we have on render or on initialized. Let's do on initialized. So it's after we've initialized our code or our page that this gets called. It's like a constructor, but it's after this initial setup gets done. Let's move this statement, Control X here, and paste it down here so that it happens after our page gets initialized. All right, let's run this again. And this time, notice, well, scroll off the page here. We have the just opened up main page right here, and it actually happened again. So we actually have two entries for it. All right, so just open up the main page. So open it twice. Off a screen here, let's see if I can put all three on the screen. I'm going to kind of shrink this down a little bit. Let's see if we can get all three to be displayed. So right now we have, we're on the main page. If we go off to the counter page, there's a counter page. Now let's go back to the main page, and we get hit one more time. So what happens is the render the first time actually gets hit twice. So on the main page, it'll get hit twice. All the other pages should only happen once. All right, but the main page happens twice the first time. Okay, but that's how you'd call a log statement. Now let's close that out, and we'll close this out. And now let's talk about how you would use this. It might not be a bad idea to have some log information statements about major things that are happening in your application. So, user created or user modified, those type of log information statements will work just fine. Now, if you have data that you want to show in these different sections, so for example, what if we had, int ID equals 25. All right, so that's our ID number for whatever reason. I'm not sure why we have it, but we have it. And you want to show this, so for ID number and then the number. What you could use string interpolation, but that's not the best way of doing it for logging. For logging, instead what we're going to do is say user ID or ID or whatever you want to call it. All right, and then you do a comma and pass in that value. Now, I intentionally did not name them the same thing because I want to make sure it's clear that this name it's kind of meaningless in a sense that it's not corresponding to anything directly, meaning you can give it whatever name you want. Now, typically, you would name it the same as the variable to be more clear. But in this case, it might be more clear to say user ID, and then you put the value for the user ID or the variable for the user ID here. So in this case, these two will match up. And what it is an order thing. So if I wanted to use the ID again, like that was ID. Different and it's not as good. It's not as robust. All right, let's just run this just to show that it does work. So I'll pull this over here and it should be down near the bottom. There you go. Just up on the main page and ID number 25, that was ID 25. So you put both values in. We've seen how we pass two different values in. All right, so again, this string is just a string, and that's all it knows about is that kind of compiled string. But when we have like Serolog, it's going to pull out the parts as well. All right, now let's start modifying how our logging system works. So right now, our logging system is just the defaults. Let's change that by going to appsettings.json, looking at the settings. Like I said before, this is the logging level for your application. So you can make changes here. So for example, I could say debug is the lowest level, and I can make these changes. However, this won't work when I hit play. I'm going to demonstrate that by actually launching this application. And I just want you to see that nothing really changes in either the console or in this window down here. We see information events, but we don't see debugging events. And here's why. Let's undo this for a minute. Right now in our Visual Studio, we're running in development mode. Remember that when I showed you the launch settings for both IIS Express and Kestrel, that we have this ASP.NET Core environment variable for both of these that says development. Well, one of the things that this does for us with our configuration is that it pulls in not only appsettings.json, but it also merges in appsettings.development.json. And so what this does is these settings in here override any settings that are similar in here. So we have logging and log level, the default is information. So even if I change this value in here to be debug, you won't see that reflected. If you miss this can be quite frustrating, especially since if you change this, let's say you deployed this somewhere, and so let's just change this to production. If this changed to production, well, in your app settings, if we go back to what we had, so let's go back to just debug, and we run this, we'll now see that there's a lot more information going on both screens because the debugging is turned on. So it's a little frustrating because you're saying, well, it works in production, but as soon as I change my setting here back to development, or as soon as I run it locally, because you may find it in production but not in development, it doesn't work. It doesn't seem to work the way I expect it to. I get just the information messages. So just note that that is the configuration file overwriting the dev configuration file, or development file, overwriting what's in appsettings.json. Okay? So with that in mind, since we're in development, we'll play around in this file. Now, if you're wondering how configuration works in general and why this works, we're going to cover that in the next lesson. So we'll talk about how these different files work and what the hierarchy is and how to change that, because this just kind of works by default for us. And so we're going to figure out how to make it even work better for us. All right? So now in this development file, we can say debug here. We can take out these other two settings. Don't forget the comma at the end. And now when we run this, we'll see the full logging with everything. Well, I thought it would. Let's try that again. Oh, wait, I see the issue here. So we've overwritten the default, which is now debug, but in our app settings, we still have these more specific rules. And since we don't have a corresponding one to overwrite to, then it's going to use the more specific rules here, but it's going to change this one to debug. So with that in mind, we can do this. Let's undo this and change both of these to debug. This way we can overwrite those specific rules as well. Let's run this again. And this time we should see a lot more messages. And we do. We see a lot of messages scrolling on the screen here. In fact, let's maximize this. And let's look at all the things that are happening. Okay? There's a lot going on here. And this is why Microsoft, by default, turns this off. But notice, for example, here is the start of the signal R connection. And so information about that connection and about what's going on there. And then the other connection route view. And it goes all the way through here. We see a bunch of information about going to new pages and what's happening. So let's do this. I'm going to navigate off screen, but I'm going to navigate to the counter page. You see all the stuff that happened here? There's a bunch of stuff that happened, but the cool thing is you can pull out of this the information that you kind of want. Notice, for instance, we have a debug message right up here that says location change to, and here's the location change, in circuit succeeded. So if we look, this message right here says Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.components.server.circuits.circuit host. So if I just say, you know what, let's capture this whole thing right here, and let's make sure that we capture just those things in debug mode and everything else in information or more mode. So let's close this out, and let's add one more, and we're going to say that full path, and we're going to say that's going to be debug, and we'll change these back to information. And we'll change the default to information as well. Let's run this again and see if we have a little bit more information, but more kind of targeted to what you want. So that gives us a bunch of information. And if we scroll to another page or go to another page, we notice we do get the message saying went to counter. So you can see that and go to fetch data, and you can see that I went to fetch data. And so it does give you some more information about what's going on here. So you can see down here in the output as well, we see the same information, and it kind of lights up the URL a little bit nicer. So this can be helpful, but the key here is you can choose what messages you want to see more of, and not just everything, which can get overwhelming. So this is the power of logging inside of Visual Studio. Sorry about that. Let's crunch this down, and let's actually close it down. So the cool thing is I can set up my development mode and make all the tweaks I want, for example, these tweaks right here, but it doesn't affect my production mode, which is still going to be this. So without making any other changes, so right now I'm getting messages saying, here's what's going on at the, here's a page to get loaded, and they're succeeded in loading and all the rest. Without changing anything else, I'll change to what would be a production environment, which is what happens when you publish your web application. So my dev settings have not changed, and yet now my logging is just information and above. So that's the power of using the development settings versus the production settings, essentially. Now you may decide that you don't want everything that Microsoft gives you by default. Now probably what's going to happen is you're going to find out you actually want a third-party logging system to do more logging or different logging. Like I mentioned, Serolog is a good option there. But for now, maybe you just want to tweak what Microsoft offers. Well, we can do that in the program.cs. See, right down here, we have this modification. And I've modified this just so you know. Notice the curly braces here. Before, and I'm not sure I can undo this, but before it had the arrow like this, and then it didn't have a return statement, it just had this like so. Which works just fine, except my settings are such that I'm not a big fan of these. I want to use block methods instead. So I changed the arrow function to be a curly brace with a return statement instead. So just note that's a little bit different tweak that I made there. And it helps because my Visual Studio is not yelling at me anymore. Okay, so now we can do is we can say dot configure logging. And so you say, okay, let's open this up. Let's say logger, then an arrow, and then here's our method. Inside the method, we're going to say logger.clear_providers. And what this does is it resets everything for logging. So it turns off all the existing logging. And now we can turn on various loggers. That way we can say, you know what, let's clear out the defaults. Now I want to turn on just the ones that I want. Now if you want to get back to what we just had, we could say logger.add_console and logger.add_debug. That's what we've been looking at so far is the output window, that's the debug, and the console is the Kestrel window. So this basically, nothing will change visually for us. All right, so if I run this and wait for it, the output still works, and so does Kestrel. Okay. Now, by the way, I need to turn off the production. Go back to development. All right. So now let's turn off the debugger. Let's not have that. So we clear the providers and just add the console. What does that look like? Well, I have log information here, but nothing down here. Now the output is still showing me the debugging from Visual Studio, but nothing from the output of our logging system. Let's flip that around. I take away this and add just the debug. So no console, just debug. This is going to look weird. There's nothing in the console window, but all our messages down here are showing up. And if I close out of the web page that I've got open here, close it out, notice it does say, hey, it's a console window. Let's go ahead and hit any key to close it. So it is active, it is working, it's just not being logged to. So this section right here is how you can configure your logging information. You can add or remove loggers if you want. You can tweak how they work, or you can go to your config file and do those changes there, the appsettings.json and appsettings.development.json. Now I encourage you to configure your loggers in here. Don't configure your loggers in code. So you can technically configure your logging system right here. So for example, you could say logger.setMinimumLevel and then set the minimum level for the logging to, let's just say, information. This line right here is the equivalent of this line right here. So why would you do it in your appsettings.json? Why would I encourage that? Well, which of these is easier to change at runtime? Your C# code or a text file? And the answer is, of course, a text file. You can make changes to these at runtime, which is very important because by default, you really want to turn these logging systems onto something more like warn level or higher. Remember these levels up here? I'm sorry, warning. Remember these levels right here? Typically, you only want to log warning, error, or critical statements. Otherwise, you have logs that just get jam-packed full of data that you don't really use. And you don't want that. You don't want massive text files or massive event logs or massive tables in a database. Instead, what you want is you want just the information you actually need, which would be warnings, errors, and critical. Maybe not warnings, but probably. All right? So at least error and critical, but probably warnings as well. That's where you want to set it for production normally. However, if you have a web server that's currently running and something weird is going on and you don't want to connect to it using a debug session of Visual Studio, you can come into the appsettings.json file manually and change the default from warning to information. And now it will capture more information about what's going on. This is a great way to debug and test or diagnose your issue. This is also something you'd use for things like services, where a service is running, but something weird's going on. Well, you can turn that logging level to information or even debug or trace and get more information about what's going on. Now, there's a lot more we can cover with logging, But I think that's as far as we need to go with this Blazor server course, because we've gone in depth into how to use the logging that's built in. If you want to add a different logging system in, you'll have to learn a little bit about how to configure it. But, and here's the really cool thing, all the statements like this right here, if you use the same iLogger system, which most major logging systems can do, if they use that, then you don't have to make any changes here. This just works with whatever logging system that you put in. You would just make a modification, probably in program.cs, things down if your logging is ultra quick. This does mean that your logger should not log directly to SQL Server, because opening a database connection and writing can be expensive. Instead, what usually happens when you have a third-party system like nlog or log4net or Serialog, if you use the SQL Server logging, what actually happens is your log files get stored on disk or in memory somewhere, and then from there they're taken and put into SQL in a background process. So you don't write directly from your log statement to SQL, you're writing to this intermediate spot that's really fast to write to. So just note that that's why we don't have asynchronous logging. Now I've shown you how to do logging right on a Razor component or Razor page. Adding this using statement and then injecting your logger. What do you do if you want to add it to, let's say, a C# class like this? Same process. Let's create a constructor. And in here, we're going to add an iLogger, control dot to add our using statement. And the iLogger should be of type weather forecast service, because that's the class it's in. We'll call it logger. Let's call it log. Control dot to create and initialize a field. And what that does is it creates a private read-only field for me, and it stores this value in that field so that down here, for example, whenever we get the forecast, I can say log information getting the forecast. All right? And now we're logging to our logger whenever we call this get forecast async. All right? So that's all you have to do for logging in a C# class. Ask dependency injection for it, because it's built right in a dependency injection, and then just use it. So log.information, log.warning, log.error, log.critical, and all the rest. You get to choose which you use. So that's it for this lesson. What we've covered is the ability to log inside of Razor Server. So first it starts off with this create default builder, which configures our logging by default out of the box. And with that, we get a few settings like these settings right here, and then the settings in app settings.development.json that set up our initial logging information. And that's all we have. And from that, we can inject our logger into our Razor pages or into our C# applications. If we want to tweak that, we can either tweak it in app settings.development.json if we just want those settings to be for development mode, or we can tweak it in app settings.json if we want those settings in production mode. Now, if you want to see what production mode looks like versus development mode, you can always go and change the environments for whatever you launch as your profile. And you can see what production looks like versus what development looks like. All right, so now it's time for you to practice this. I really encourage you to practice it well, try it out, try different things, see what works, see what doesn't work. Maybe go back and watch that section if it doesn't work the way that you think that you thought it did, because there's a lot of little tweaks here, little changes that you might have to do in order to get this right. But logging is really important to your application, and it's one of the things that Microsoft gives you out of the box included because they think it's that important, just like dependency injection. So definitely figure it out, figure out how to make it work, and then think through your plan for how you're going to put logging in your applications. Okay? Once you do all that, then come on back for the next lesson.